So we have some ideas of DSMBs, and I just want to say that they are extremely helpful, and certainly if you have a blinded trial, phase 3 trial, they're compulsory, I think, and NIH's policy requires it, and I think many other institutions would as well. But not all trials need the DSMB. There are many other ways to protect the patients. And you can read about these policies from various institutes. NIH, just to give you some general guidelines for when you do need one of these bodies. All trials need a safety monitoring plan, a plan for how they're going to make sure the data in the trial are conducted as intended and have integrity, and also to protect the safety. But as soon as you have multi-center phase 3 trials, that an independent DSMB has been required since 1979. It's also required that the IRBs are notified of all DSMB recommendations. And I'd say beyond that, the policies start to vary between institutes. I used to work at NIH, and I know that as soon as a trial was blinded and randomized, it had a DSMB. But that is not true across all institutes. So it would be even phase 2 at NIH. So here's some links that you can go to read about these guidances. The FDA, I actually think, is a very informative guidance, and would recommend that reading if you wanted to as well. It's pretty comprehensive if you're interested in thinking about the best practices in forming these committees. I would say that there is no policy of the FDA on what you should do, or there's no requirements of what is done, but simply recommendations, because they're not governing, say, pharmaceutical firms or other, but in terms of how they do these DSMBs, but they will make recommendations on best practice. Same thing for how to do a statistical analysis, how to monitor your trial. The FDA has a lot of guidance documents. If you haven't found those, I'd look online. Very useful. I did want to point out also, for those of you who are at NIH, it was interesting that there's quite a while sort of understanding that the centers and institutes differ in terms of how they do DSMBs, and some of them are a lot more open to the idea of the study sponsor being a participant, a heavy participant in the DSMB and the executive session, and some complaints have lodged from investigators about an interference or a conflict of interest. And so the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General took a couple of years, I think 2009, 2010, and reviewed all the DSMBs across the institutes and centers, interviewed the investigators, DSMB members, the sponsor, and just asked sort of a set of questions to try to evaluate whether these DSMBs were conducted in a way that met NIH's own policy, and if there are any challenges to the way things are currently being done in terms of to the DSMB effectiveness. And this makes for good reading. It's a brief report, but you can see there were recommendations, but there was sort of a back and forth between NIH officials and the Health and Human Services in terms of what recommendations or sort of assessments of what was needed and not needed, particularly on the issue of that independence actually is the real sticking point, I think, between some of the institutes and those outside of the NIH. But the main findings were that the NIH DSMBs did meet the guidance. Overwhelmingly across all those interviewed, there was a few dissenting opinions, but quite a number that said across the investigators through the members that the policies were being met. But there were complaints, particularly from certain investigators, about participation of study staff in the closed meetings was not in all circumstances seen to be helpful, but in other circumstances it was pointed out that it was helpful because they were the experts in certain rare diseases. They were the study staff that had think about these issues day and night. So I think maybe one size does not fit all, but that is still room for debate in how we do these things. I think another issue was that we do these reports as masked, and there wasn't really good understanding amongst all members of the DSMB themselves that were interviewed that they had the right to ask for the unblinding codes. And so there was a recommendation to avoid that confusion, and certainly to make sure this was an accepted policy, that it state in the policies in all centers that the DSMB has the right to see unmasked data. to make sure that's absolutely clear. That was historically seen as a challenge that some DSMB members had no idea. And then ultimately, what's really interesting about this field is it's incredibly complex. So when you see on someone's resume that they were the one on the CAST trial, and you're doing a cardiovascular trial, you're going to want those same people on your DSMB. And so you have these same experts serving on the HIV trials or the cardiovascular trials, and it's an aging population of experts when you see them talk, and there's a lot of concern that this expertise is going to disappear and that we don't have enough people who are new that are engaging in this activity. And so there's active efforts across NIH and other sponsored trial settings to get new people into this endeavor, which, as you can imagine, is quite complex. So the NIH, it was recommended they should direct the ICs, the institutes and centers, to at least articulate the circumstances in which the institutes and center staff can participate in the DSMB. So at least everyone knows what to expect, and at least in those circumstances understand if a particular IC member is not abiding by their own restrictions. And so that was seen as agreed. Also, it was unilaterally agreed that they would make it more clear that all DSMBs that the policies specifically say that the DSMBs have access to unmasked data. That was an easy fix. And that they're all working on ways to identify and recruit new members. So with this sort of negotiated set of recommendations, the NIH agreed. Oops. Okay, so sort of talking about earlier that it's not always needed to have an independent body. You can imagine it's quite a complex and expensive endeavor to get a group of experts like this and fly them around the world to have these meetings. They are sort of universally accepted as important and needed when you have large randomized trials with mortality or major morbidity, certainly. If the trial, for whatever reasons, has implications for public health, you're going to want an independent body to help you through the conducting of this trial. If there's a serious toxicity that's thought to be a risk, or potentially, for whatever reasons, other kinds of high-risk treatments, then people generally, even if it's not blinded, might think about having a DSMB as an independent advisory board to help make decisions about what might be an ethically complex situation. And generally, if there's a vulnerable population, whether it be children or pregnant women or however you might define vulnerable, folks with Alzheimer's or dementia, these would be populations that would need extra protections. When they're not needed, typically if you don't have any of those ethical, tricky, or seen as difficult situations, but maybe run-of-the-mill, allergy medicines, and they're so not anything unusual in terms of risks being taken, single-arm trials, not blinded. There's really no reason to have an independent body if everyone can see the totality of evidence as people accrue. Short-term trials, it's almost impossible to get a DSMB together if a trial is going to be quite quick in terms of accrual and endpoints. And so there's no point, it can't stop early. So what is the DSMB going to do? And certainly, I think when you have that unblinded data with no ethical reason to be extra concerned, there's really no need for a DSMB. And there are disadvantages. So a lot of people just want to be better safe than sorry, but it increases the complexity of the trial management. Once you say you're going to do these DSMB meetings, they have to happen. It increases costs. And so I think the thought is that you should, and to think we have a sort of a small set of individuals who can serve on these boards that have expertise in your area. Don't use them up in a situation where they're not really needed, and keep them fresh and available for situations where you really do need them. So I think that's another important reason, especially in smaller fields, to think about whether you don't have one if you don't think you need one. Because you have many other forms of monitoring. You can have your own local safety monitors, perhaps some kind of partial, if you're not going to be monitoring efficacy, but you want extra experts to monitor safety, then you can recruit those form a specific safety monitoring board without all the other extra goals that a DSMB typically has. You have the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that's going to look at the human subjects at your institution. And the protocol team themselves should be constantly reviewing how their study is going and the safety of the patients in their study. So, as promised, it's going to go from those big concepts to some just nuts and bolts of example tables or shells of things that I've seen in monitoring reports. Many of you, if you're familiar with clinical research, know about the consort diagram. I think it's useful to see it in the DSMB report, because then you can see how many people are being screened, approached, and how many of those are accepting and accepting and then failing the eligibility criteria later for other reasons. It gives you an idea of feasibility and representation, and then also a great concise way to look at things like, of those that should have been analyzed, what percent were withdrawn, lost to follow-up, that discontinued early, or completed. All of those things, I think, are very useful and quite concisely summarized in a consort diagram. Going back to validity, and are you doing the protocol that you intended? Are you going to have interpretable results? You definitely want to look at missed visits. You want to look at them by visit. You want to look at the baseline. Certainly, if you're not even getting through the baseline, that's a concern. And you want to see how many are completing the last visit. Overdue forms, that might give you an idea of whether or not your protocol is a little too difficult in terms of the schedule. People are willing to do it but can't quite make the timelines. It's useful information. It might also be very fixable. Baseline characteristics, are these the people you intended to enroll? Are they balanced by arm? If randomization worked, these things should be balanced by arm, but randomization doesn't always work, and sometimes it's been discovered in meetings like this by DSMB. Serious adverse events. Now, in many ways, that's a no-brainer. Obviously, a DSMB is going to look at that. But I think what's important is how you present it to the DSMB. If you have 4,000 people in the trial and you're going to present line listings of every sniffle and headache, they'll never find the issues of concern. And that is a concern. And so you want to be complete, maybe have appendices of all the events in case somebody asks a question about a particular one. But you're going to want to think about how to summarize this so the necessary trends can become apparent if there are any. And then you want appropriate detail sort of at the fingertips of start and stop dates. How long did it take for these AEs to resolve? Did they resolve? People often ask, what is the relationship that they think of this adverse event? If something happens to a person on the trial, they fell down the stairs, whatever it is, it has to be reported if there's an injury to a patient in your trial. And sometimes it's quite obvious that maybe it is obvious, maybe it's not. Maybe they fell down the stairs because they were dizzy and it had to do with the treatment. And so essentially you can ask for the expert opinion. The investigators often will list what they think is whether it's probably related, possibly related, definitely related, or unrelated. But ultimately you want it presented to the DSMB so they can make their own opinions. With the opinion of the investigator who's an expert, it's very it's useful to have, but it should also just be considered and not thought of as absolute. So you also then want to start to summarize these maybe by body system. If these can happen multiple times, perhaps you count the number of individuals who've had at least one event, the timing of the first event, the seriousness of the worst event, things like that. The fundamental concept here is that the summaries should be able to easily present, allow trends to just arise to the top. So something that's visually easy to look at, and in this particular one, there's not a lot of interesting data here, but you might think about as a percent of the total number who were treated, how many had any infection or sinusitis, or so you might start with the sum category and then the individual categories of those with at least a 10% rate, and then list them both as overall and then by worst grade. And oftentimes the DSMB, if they don't see something that they want to see, they'll ask for it. And so in addition, of course, if this is part of the plan, you would be looking at efficacy generally for long trials or risky trials or trials where people might stand to have a huge benefit. You might think about interim monitoring. And so you might look at the percent of treatment success, an area under the curve, a Kaplan-Meier curve, And then you would have your official boundaries if you were doing efficacy or futility monitoring. And you would just simply look at the boundary and where you were relative to the boundary and probably the whole history. So you can kind of say how the data are trending. The basic concepts are you want to make it as easy as possible for the DSMB to do their job. So the report should be provided to the DSMB in enough time for the review to happen. They should be able to look at it before the meeting and think about it. Don't email it to them the night before. The report should include a concise summary of the trial itself. Who knows how many boards these DSMB members are on? Typically they serve on multiple because of that expertise that they have. So include that schema, that one-page summary that you have in your protocol telling you the basic endpoints, the number to enroll, the primary objective, the terse analysis plan. You should have an executive summary that processes the main points of what the say for the open report in any case, where you are in accrual and how many new AEs since the last meeting, things like that. And the tables and figures should be concise, easy to understand, and of course accurate. So, hopefully I've given you some information today that you can appreciate. The DSMBs, they do have a very difficult job ahead of them and a very important job. They have to balance individual ethics and collective ethics, risk-benefit. They have to think about statistically technical things in terms of being able to interpret interim monitoring efficacy boundaries and inflations of false positive rate. Sometimes they need to consider futility and the balance of what can be gained if you continue versus not continuing. And most importantly, something that sometimes gets lost, which is the decisions are not purely statistical. In general, they are always taking into account much more than a simple boundary or one statistic, and are often very complex in terms of how many different aspects you might consider in terms of overall if the trial should continue as planned or some alteration. And finally, I always like to emphasize, because sometimes investigators, I think, just want this weight of decision-making on somebody else's shoulders. But the DSMB is there to offer advice and guidance, but it is the investigator and the sponsor ultimately who bear the responsibility of stopping or going. And, here are some future readings. I'll say, if like those that I mentioned, if you like suspense novels, read The Data Monitoring in Clinical Trials, a Case Studies Approach. First author, Dave Demetz, who's a great storyteller and who's involved in a lot of landmark trials and interesting DSMBs, where, with just unexpected swings and curveballs, and does a good job explaining, sort of lessons learned as well as telling these good stories. Really informative book, as well as the one by Susan Ellenberg and this overall reference by Friedman, Farberg, and Demetz. And the other two here at the end are statistical references. If there are any statisticians out there who want to know more about the nuts and bolts of these boundaries and other statistical issues, those are both very good references. So thank you very much. I'll stop at time for a few questions if you have any. Yes, and I'll try to remind myself to repeat your question because I know no one else other than the 20 people in this room can hear you. So go ahead.
Do you ever have situations where the DSMB can't reach a consensus if the member experts have disagreements among themselves?
Yes, so the question was, are there ever, if I sort of aware of situations where the DSMB themselves can't come to a consensus? And yeah, that absolutely can happen. Obviously, you think about, you can have a hung jury, you can have a hung DSMB. And, honestly, I think about, a lot of times in the charter, there are rules such as, first of all, if you want to think about how many members is a reasonable amount for there to be a quorum, because it's impossible to make sure that everyone gets to every meeting. So the first challenge is to make sure you have enough people at that meeting to vote. And others then will say that a decision, there might be a majority minority, and they will report to the sponsor the outcome of the vote, that it wasn't unanimous. So you have like the Supreme Court, you have the dissenting opinion. Because this is advice giving, in some sense, there's no absolute reason other than it would be nice for the sponsor and the investigator if the DSMB could come up with a clear recommendation. But the answer might not be clear. And so the importance is to present the two opinions. Sometimes you can have a member, and I've certainly heard it's a bit like social engineering. Like, people need to get along. You need to think about, I think, the personalities involved and can they work together in a difficult situation. And it's not that it's difficult because it's a challenging job ahead. And so if you have a very opinionated person who's not ever going to listen to anyone else's opinion, that's not a great person to have on the DSMB. So there have been times when people have essentially been asked to leave, or it's been uncomfortable enough for them that people just resign. They just know it's not going to work out, and they're replaced because they can't function well as a body. So a lot of times, I know at NIAID there was one person whose job it was to think about how to make the DSMB. She was in the division, essentially the division of AIDS or anything related to infectious disease. There was at NIAID they have separate divisions, say one for transplant or allergies, and the division I was in was focused on infectious disease. And she spent, she networked, she knew the people who served on these bodies, and she would kind of create these bodies and think about, that person's not going to get along with that person, which is kind of stupid in some sense. We're scientists, but at the same time, it's like you guys have to work together. That group has to work together, and personalities inevitably will come into play. Yeah.
Is there a waiver or a challenge process where somebody can go back, the investigator can go back and perhaps challenge what they said?
Yeah, so the question was, is there some kind of waiver or challenge process that an investigator can essentially challenge one of the recommendations of the DSMB? And I can say I definitely was in a situation, I can't remember all the specifics. I was on the study team, not the DSMB, and the DSMB made a recommendation about the treatment. I think it had to do with uncomfortable number of AEs. But the investigator presented an opposing opinion. These AEs were very treatable, this disease was very dire. They kind of came up with something that gave the DSMB more information to process the data, and so there was like a series of letters that were brought back and forth, and then ultimately the DSMB, issued a statement they were more comfortable with, that I think the DSMB might have even recommended stopping, and in the end they didn't, and they gave reasons why, and then everyone was comfortable, and they wound on, and that study was positive in the end, and wound up in the New England Journal. So, the DSMB offers advice. I think if there was a DSMB that felt very strongly, and the WHI, I don't know, to think about, that in itself needs a whole lecture. It's hard to just dabble into that example. But I do know that the first DSMB recommended stopping, and the sponsors, whatever the reasons, they didn't want to, and they continued, and they got a whole other body. And it's and so that's the sponsor's prerogative. But they have public opinion, they have the scientific community that at the end will judge all of these actions. And their sponsors' only responsibility ultimately is to listen to the DSMB, but they are the decision makers. So the idea of challenging that, I think the investigators want to make sure the DSMB understands that they don't want to feel like they're not ignoring the DSMB's advice. They want to continue together to continue on in the trial. So a lot of times if you're not going to stop as recommended, the investigators like to explain why and get the DSMB on board, and so they can continue in a congenial and agreeable manner.
How is the DSMB financed? Who pays for their expenses?
So the question is about how are these things financed. So the DSMB, I believe there is an honorarium for the meetings that might require travel. Not always, I don't think. So that is, I'm a little bit unclear. I've definitely been in situations where I've received honorariums and situations where I haven't. But so there might be a small honorarium, and certainly all of your expenses in terms of travel. Most people prefer, especially in maybe ethically challenging or complex trials, in-person meetings. So all that travel expenses, it's all part of the grant of the study. The study sponsor covers all of that. And if the DSMB says, we need an extra meeting, and there's 12 of them coming from around the country, the sponsor has to cough up that money. So they have to have reserve funds to be able to cover a DSMB. And so you make a guesstimate like you do, say, if it's a grant-funded study. And potentially, if it's unexpected burden, perhaps a study team could go back to their sponsor, whether it's the NIH or if it's an industry sponsor, and figure out a way to get supplemental funds if necessary. Patient safety is the primary responsibility. Are there any other questions? All right, well, if not, thank you for your attention, and I'll be for a few extra minutes if anyone else wanted to come up offline and ask questions. Thank you very much for your time.